Hello, and welcome back to the Lifestyle School podcast, where we break down what it really takes to live a healthy, sustainable lifestyle. I'm Hope Plack, and my goal here is to give you practical tips and real life strategies to help you feel your best, take control of your health, and live a life that aligns with your goals. Today's episode is going to challenge some common beliefs because for years we have been told that salt is the enemy when it comes to high blood pressure and heart disease. But what if salt has been wrongfully accused? What if the real problem, the silent culprit, is actually sugar? If you've been cutting back on salt yet still struggling with bloating, high blood pressure, or fatigue, this episode is for you. We're going to dig into the fascinating and honestly frustrating story of how salt got demonized for what sugar was actually doing to our bodies. Before we dive in, I want to make this perfectly clear. This podcast is for educational purposes only. I am not a doctor, and this is not medical advice. Always talk to your healthcare provider before making any major changes to your diet, especially if you have underlying health conditions. And I will say, especially specifically regarding salt, if you are on specific medications, if you have specific health conditions, you must talk to your health care provider before making any changes. With that, let's dive in. So it seems like there's this common theme that we have been noticing over the course of these past 12 episodes. Can you believe we're in episode 12, guys, of the Lifestyle School podcast? I thought about starting this podcast a year ago, and maybe I would have been, 60 episodes deep if I'd actually done it then. But timing is everything, and I feel like right now has been the time. So we are 12 episodes in, and I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here, for listening, because truly, I love this stuff. I love learning. I love the history of nutrition. I love learning more about how our bodies works. And, as I'm researching for these episodes, I'm learning right along with you on some of these topics, and it's just so fun, and I love to actually get to share this with you. So this common theme over the past 12 episodes, when we look at like the history of nutrition, maybe you'll remember this if you've been with us this whole time, is a lot of things changed in nutrition between the 1940s and really the 1970s. And so for this episode regarding salt and sugar, we're going to rewind to the 1970s. This is when the so-called salt scare took off, and it started with a scientist named Dr. Lewis Dahl. Dr. Dahl conducted studies that linked salt to high blood pressure, but here's the problem. His research involved feeding lab rats huge, let me say huge, doses of sodium, far more than any human would realistically consume. So to give you some perspective, the rats in these studies were given the human equivalent of about 500 grams of sodium a day. That is about 50 times what the average person consumes. So it's kind of absurd, but those exaggerated findings made headlines, and suddenly salt became the villain. And in a little bit, this is going to make more sense how this all came about when we talk about the sugar cover up, but I'm getting ahead of myself, guys. So the narrative stuck, and soon after, the DASH diet came about, which emphasized lowering sodium and was introduced as the gold standard for reducing high blood pressure. And while the DASH diet did show some success, it wasn't just because of reduced sodium. It was because the diet emphasized potassium-rich foods like vegetables, fruits, and nuts. So let's just say also like whole foods, right? And here's the thing about potassium. Maybe you knew this, maybe you didn't, but it is like nature's blood pressure regulator. It helps your body manage sodium levels. Did you know that? So was salt really the issue, or was the real magic happening because the DASH diet added back the potassium that was processed, that processed foods were missing? And, this is the thing as you dive more into the nutrition sciences and nutrition research. And while I am a strong believer that we need good research, it is incredibly difficult to get really good nutritional research because there are so many confounding factors and variables. And when people track their food for nutrition research, The data that they collect is typically garbage. I'm just going to be totally honest. Like people filling out a survey about what they ate, people don't, when we talked about calories a couple weeks ago, people don't accurately record what they ate. They think they do much better than they typically did, honestly. They underreport calories. And then you have all these other lifestyle factors that hopefully you've learned over, listening to this material the last 12 episodes that greatly impact so many other areas of how your body's going to respond to this food. So, anyway, I'm getting off topic, but so the question with this DASH diet, if I'm going to rewind, is adding that potassium back into the diet. What really made this diet successful? So, meanwhile, while the world is being told to eat less salt because the DASH diet worked, these rats were having issues because we were overloading them with sodium. Something far more dangerous was quietly making its way into almost every food on store shelves. And let me give you a second to think about what that was. Hopefully, it should pop right into your mind, and that is sugar. So, now this is part of the story that is quite wild, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier. In 2016, documents were uncovered that revealed the Sugar Research Foundation. Yes, there is a Sugar Research Foundation. And like, if you just think about that for a second, do you think the Sugar Research Foundation was actually out to find out if sugar was good? Or do you think it was created by people who make sugar to promote the benefits of sugar? Let's just use common sense here. Probably the latter, right? So in 2016, documents were uncovered that revealed that the Sugar Research Foundation, it now has a different name. The sugar industry itself was paid Harvard scientists back in the 1960s to shift the blame for heart disease away from sugar and, you guessed it, onto fat and salt. I'm going to say that again for the people in the back. In 2016, documents were uncovered that revealed that the Sugar Research Foundation, the sugar industry itself, paid Harvard, yes, Harvard, scientists back in the 1960s to shift the blame for heart disease away from sugar and onto fat and salt. Things that we have been eating for hundreds of years with no problems, in actually pretty high quantities. So let that sink in for a second. Instead of warning the public about the dangers of excess sugar, they redirected the blame. Sounds familiar, right? This is hopefully at this point, this is not shocking to you. Personally, it's not at all shocking to me. They knew that by villainizing fat and salt, sugar could quietly sneak into nearly every processed food product on the market shelves without people questioning its impact on their health. And as a result, food manufacturers embraced low fat and low sodium products. But to make those foods taste good, because, right, fat has, if you've listened to past episodes, it does have a dopamine effect. It has this specific satiety factor. And we all know there's that bliss point with food between salt, sugar, and fat. But food manufacturers knew that to make food taste good, if they were lowering fat content and lowering sodium, they had to increase the sugar content, right? And everything from salad dressings to bread to so-called quote unquote healthy snacks became loaded with hidden sugars. And if you have been someone who's, recently maybe tried to start looking at food labels, you, I'm sure, have just realized wow, sugar is literally in everything. Things you wouldn't maybe think sugar was in, sugar is in. It's everywhere. Meanwhile, the food industry knew they were creating a monster, but they buried the evidence. In the early 1800s, the average person consumed about 2 to 4 pounds of sugar per year. So again, 2 to 4 pounds of sugar per year. And that sugar was typically from natural sources like seasonal fruits or honey. But by the year 2000, the average person was eating somewhere between 150 to 170 pounds of sugar per year. So essentially, and we talked about this in a previous episode, we went from eating 2 to 4 pounds of sugar per year to eating about that amount a week, which is absolutely wild. No wonder we're having all these metabolic health issues and weight issues because that is 20 times what our ancestors consumed. So whether you believe in creation, whether you believe in uh, evolution, like our bodies, like they just can't handle it. We're not created. We didn't evolve. I believe we were created. But we didn't, our bodies just like can't handle that. Our mitochondria, the powerhouses of our cells cannot handle that burden of sugar. So the crazy part is this explosion in sugar consumption happened alongside the rise in hypertension, obesity, and heart disease, yet salt was still taking the blame. So, how exactly does sugar drive high blood pressure and heart disease, you might ask? Well, it all comes down to, drum roll please, I don't know if you can hear that, insulin, right? Something that we talk about a lot over on my channel, Hope Black Coaching, on Instagram and Facebook, as well as in this Lifestyle School podcast. Here's the connection most people don't realize is that when you eat sugar or refined carbohydrates, your blood sugars spike, right? Your body responds, your pancreas releases insulin to help shuttle the sugar into our cells. But when you're eating sugar constantly, think like a sugary coffee drink in the morning, you have that snack of crackers that is just purely refined wheat that we talked about last week in our episode, totally bleached flour that turns immediately into glucose molecules, and other ultra processed foods, your insulin levels stay elevated. And here's the kicker. Insulin tells your kidneys to retain sodium, and this sodium retention leads to fluid buildup, which raises your blood pressure. And so, many people, when they start lifestyle school, they start eating whole foods, they get the ultra processed food out of their diet, they start time restricted eating, they start fasting, their blood pressure comes down significantly and very quickly, typically to the point where sometimes, they have to get off medication very quickly. And again, anytime you want to get off medication, you need to be working with your medical doctor. But this is like something that happens so quickly. And people, if you're even not on medication, will realize, wow, like my body is losing so much water weight and water retention when I start fasting. And that's why it's so important that you have to hydrate with minerals, specifically salt, magnesium, and potassium while you're fasting, because when your insulin is being driven down through these dietary and lifestyle changes, it tells your kidneys, hey, let's release this extra fluid that we don't need. And while you're busy cutting salt, if you're still eating sugar-laden processed foods, you're actually worsening your metabolic health. And no amount of low sodium products is actually going to fix that, because going low sodium isn't going to fix your insulin resistance issue, which could be at the heart of your hypertension. And this is why you'll often hear stories of people who drastically cut sugar and processed carbs, and suddenly their blood pressure improves, right? Even though they didn't touch their salt intake. So now here's something that might surprise you. For most of human history, salt consumption was actually much, much higher than what's recommended today, sometimes 20 to 30 grams per day in certain populations, yet heart disease was very rare. And so, you could just ask the basic question of why was this, right? And that's because these populations weren't eating ultra processed foods filled with refined carbs, bleached wheat, and sugar. They ate whole foods, they stayed active, they had a lot of movement, and they consumed plenty of potassium, which is naturally balances our sodium in the body. And, salt wasn't the problem. The problem is the modern combination of processed foods that combine with salt, with sugar and refined oils, insulin resistance that alters our sodium regulation, and then a dramatic decline in potassium-rich whole foods in our diet. And that's the real recipe for hypertension and heart disease, and it's why simply cutting salt rarely solves the problem. Like, I would like you to ask yourself this question. Do you know someone who has had hypertension, has reduced their salt, and has actually solved their hypertension? Personally, working in clinic with people who have come in with all sorts of issues, hypertension included. I can't tell you one person who I know who reduced their salt and it resolved their hypertension. And hypertension is not something to joke around with. It's like a very serious condition. So, and the thing when it comes to sugar, I said 150 to 170 pounds of sugar in our diets per year, and you might be thinking, oh well, that's not me. That's someone else. And I want to tell you the story because honestly, it was like a little shocking to me as I was experiencing it. So, um, I had a student the other day who came into class with a soda. I believe it was a squirt soda, which I was like, oh, that's kind of a throwback. I haven't seen that flavor in a long time, but it was like a liter plastic bottle, so a little bit bigger than a can. I think probably 16 ounces. And I was just, being curious. I was like, hey, like, let's see how many like grams of sugar are in that soda for you. And this kid is about 10 and he turns it around. He's like, oh, it's only 180 calories. Like, that's not bad. And it's like, actually calories don't really matter, guys. So I always try to like sneak a little nutrition into these kids' class, even if it's not necessarily on the menu for what we're talking about that day. But he was like, oh, I was like, well, what's more important is like how much sugar is in it. And there was over 60 grams of sugar in that 16-ounce soda. And I was like, okay, well, let's like give this kid and all the kids in the class like a visual in their mind of how much sugar that actually is because we're Americans. We don't use the metric system, right? We don't know what grams actually mean. So I quickly Googled like the conversion of like how many, I was like, it's probably around fourth a cup. So I Googled how many teaspoons are in a fourth a cup. And it was 12, and there was about 15 teaspoons of sugar in this soda because you take the number of grams divided by four, and that gives you the equivalent in teaspoons. And then I, multiplied that. Anyway, it was over a fourth a cup of sugar in this can or like a bottle of pop or soda. I'm from the Midwest, guys. That's why I say pop. And I think everyone was kind of like, oh, wow, that's so much. But just think of it. If you have two of those a day, if you have a dessert, maybe you have a glass of wine, or, maybe you have some different processed food, processed snacks, dried fruit throughout the day, all of that sugar adds up super quickly. And it makes it, not hard to believe that maybe we do eat 2 to 3 pounds of sugar per week. And so I want you to take like a real hard, honest look. It can be really hard to be honest with ourselves about what we're actually eating, what we're actually doing, and how that's affecting our life. I know for me personally, I recently had a day where I just like went off the rails. I felt like a little bit, and I had these muffins, and then I had some dried fruit, and then I was you know, after I ate them and I kind of enjoyed part of it. I would say it wasn't worth it, but I was sitting there feeling like garbage, like I knew would probably happen. My stomach felt really bloated. It felt like I had a rock in my stomach. And it was like, was this worth it? Like, was actually eating this worth it? And I think it's so important. No one is perfect, myself included, to just have those really honest, hard looks at our diet, at our lifestyle, at the foods we're choosing to put into our bodies and saying, like, is this really self-care? Is this like honoring and respecting my body? Because so many times we, treat ourselves with something sweet or, a special drink that has a lot of sugar in it. But is that really a treat for our body? Is that really like loving and respecting our body? Maybe yes, maybe no. I can't answer that question for you, but I know in regards to myself, as someone with a grandparent who died with wildly uncontrolled a type 2 diabetes that led to dementia, as someone who's dealt with insulin resistance, which does lead to type 2 diabetes if unresolved, it's not worth it for me, right? And like when I choose to reward myself in that way, I'm not pointing myself down a path that's directed towards a future that I want. So, sorry, this is kind of like a total sidebar, but I think it's just really important as we think about salt, as we think about sugar, is to have those like real conversations about food and how we feel about the foods that we're eating. And I think it really starts with being honest with ourselves because nothing can change unless we really have that like come to Jesus moment where we're like, I'm not doing as good as I think I could be doing, or I'm not really taking care of myself in a way that I feel like I should. And from there, we can start to make change and, get to where we want to be in our lives. So, anyway, coming back on track. Sorry, guys, just total bunny trail, but that's part of the fun of doing a podcast is I can kind of take this wherever I want, right? So thanks for hanging with me. Okay. So what do we do instead of all the sugar? Um, I want to give you guys some solutions. If you're serious about improving your metabolic health, here's where I would start. First of all, kind of what I alluded to is you have to kind of sit down and really evaluate like where are you? Like what do you want for your future and what are the decisions you're making right now doing for that future? Is it taking you farther away from it, or is it pointing you and taking you down the path towards that future that you want? Have that hard conversation with yourself. Next, you got to cut out the processed food, not just because they're salty, but because they combine sodium with sugar and refined oils, which fuel inflammation and which fuel insulin resistance. It's always the first part. And I was actually talking to someone last night, and you can pretty much go to any diet, whether it's carnivore, paleo, vegetarian. And when people cut out ultra processed food and start eating a quote unquote certain way, like with a certain diet, they lose weight and they feel better. But typically, what that all comes back to is the fact that they cut out processed food, at least for a time, right? And so that's where we really have to start. Secondly, we got to prioritize whole foods. So fresh vegetables. I would say start with high quality protein, then healthy fats. So you're going to feel satiated. The combination of protein and healthy fat are really what's going to help you feel full and satisfied and not craving the sweets, right? And then add in those vegetables and that fiber on top of that as you have room. I wouldn't start with vegetables, honestly. I'd start with the protein and the fat. And these are going to naturally help balance your body's sodium and potassium levels. And then after that, I'd increase your potassium-rich foods. If you do deal with something like hypertension, or maybe you have a family history of that, things like avocados, which are healthy fats, technically a fruit, but it's healthy fats, leafy greens, and things like wild-caught salmon. Those are going to be some really great options. And then lastly, focus on improving your insulin sensitivity. And that's something that we really focus on in lifestyle school. So strategies like fasting, reducing refined carbohydrates, prioritizing protein at meals, doing time restricted eating, and things of that nature. Because the bottom line, salt isn't the villain, and sugar and processed foods are the real enemy when it comes to insulin resistance, hypertension, heart disease, metabolic dysfunction, and so many issues that we're dealing with as a society today. And just this last week, I was telling a client, we can't blame salt for what sugar did. And that's really at the end of the day what this whole episode comes down to. So if this episode challenged, what you've been told about salt and sugar, I want to encourage you to keep digging. There's a reason why metabolic issues like hypertension, obesity, and diabetes have exploded in recent decades. And it's not because we suddenly started using our salt shakers more than we had in the past. Like we're no longer, like salting meats and smoking them and preserving them, right? We have fridges. We don't totally different issue here. And so with that, I want to say thank you for tuning into the Lifestyle School podcast. If you found this episode helpful, I'd love for you to share it with a friend. Leave us a review, preferably 5 stars. Leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts or if you have any experience with this. It's conversations like these that can help us break free from some outdated nutrition myths and really focus in on what matters, which is sustainable and healthy living. With that, I will see you next time here at the Lifestyle School podcast, where we're committed to giving you practical strategies for living a life you love. If you want to come say hi, head over to Instagram, send me a message, and I would love to hear from you. Take care, guys. See you next week.